Hello and welcome to GCA Studios, brought to you by Game Change Agency. I'm your host, Jay Taylor. My guest today is Hira Advani, who is Director and Chief Security Compliance Officer at IBM Corporation. Hira is responsible for the software portfolio there. He's a highly talented business and technology executive who's led global teams across the business to deliver successful outcomes for strategic software initiatives during his extensive career. Hira has also transformed culture by taking a value-based approach to adoption of essential policies and practices, which is so important. His current focus is on security practices for the enterprise, but he's also involved in board of director interactions regarding cybersecurity. Hira, welcome to GCA Studios. Let's start by having you tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Hey, thanks, Jay. I'm glad to be here. So if I can add a few more words on what Jay introduced me as and my role, it was basically to enhance the security of IBM's portfolio against potential threats and breaches, all with the goal to protect our clients and our customers. Because clients do trust us in terms of licensing our software, as well as making sure that the SaaS applications which they use protect their data. So we have to make sure that the security best practices are in place, but more importantly, leverage best practices which exists in the industry also. So that's a very critical role that I have played. My current focus builds on that experience of the past decade or more, actually, in this area, to raise the awareness of cybersecurity threats across three constituencies. Yes, there's a board of directors because at the apex, the board of directors really have oversight responsibilities, and so cybersecurity and the dynamics at play are very important with the board of directors. Second one is to make sure that consultancies who provide guidance, advice, and counsel to their clients are well aware and versed in cybersecurity and what the trends and directions are. And thirdly, not forgetting is B schools, because remember, they're grooming the future leaders who are going to be C-suite execs as well as board of directors, responsible individuals. And they need to have a sense and grounding about cybersecurity, so it is not an IT thing, it's more of a business thing. And that's very important. And the good news actually on that front is actually business schools have begun to make it a mandatory part of the curriculum. So before you graduate, you're going to have a cybersecurity experienced individual who's got an MBA degree also. So it's going to be a good, I think, bringing together of business as well as cybersecurity skills together.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And it really is a business issue. A lot of people don't understand that. So it's great that you make that point. Board directors and senior leaders are really bombarded these days with all kinds of information about cyber risk, and it's usually portrayed in such a way that it's a great concern. So where do you see the greatest cybersecurity threats in organizations today? And really, who would be the appropriate executive to take the lead on improving the management around this in most organizations?
Yeah, and that couldn't be a more appropriate question right now, because just 6 months ago, the results of 6 months ago that came out that there were 29% increase in data breaches as of June of this year. That's phenomenal, because generally the industry was expecting, after all the attention being paid and investments, we would plateau. But what this result, the 29% increase is telling us, it's actually gone up and maybe even accelerating, which is a problem in itself. So the greatest risk right now is actually this privacy compromise of data is the greatest thing and a great impediment right now in the industry today, because this data breaches continue unabated. So that's a problem. And establishing a governance model in any business is very important to safeguard a business unit with the help of a CSO as a point person to make sure that the security practices are very well ingrained in the organization itself. And safeguarding a business today is a responsibility of everyone in the organization, including employees of a business. We've heard so much about phishing effects, which hurt the business anytime, because employees inadvertently click on a link, which is a bad link, and allows outside actors to get entrenched in the organization. So security is everyone's business. It's very important to address that.
Mm-hmm. And somebody's got to take the lead for it to make sure it gets done.
Yeah, and the CISO is on point to make that happen, along with other C-suite executives like myself, who are responsible for the client as well as employees in the organization.
Yeah. Sometimes the weakest link in the chain, right, is the most danger to the organization. And oftentimes those third parties are that weak link.
Yep, yep. That's also a very important point. Yes.
I think boards have to be more involved these days in getting comfortable with those policies and procedures that are being adopted around cyber. Are there certain policies or practices that boards have to agree upon or should agree upon so that they're really prepared to handle any kind of a cyber attack event that might occur?
Yeah, I think that's an important aspect which boards really need to rally around and get the arms around. I think the three-point approach is really helpful here. So the boards can undertake with the management. It's a joint partnership with management and C-suite to ensure that the right policies and practices are in place. And what do I mean by that? First and foremost, be secure. Enhance the risk prioritized control in the organization to safeguard sensitive data. That's point number one. The next is to make sure you're vigilant. Always be vigilant to detect violations as well as anomalies which are occurring in the organization. It could be from insiders, it could be external actors who are trying to take advantage of the organization. So be vigilant, always on the lookout for bad things happening, because nothing is better than intercepting a bad actor early on rather than 30 days later. Damage can be horrendous if you do it later. And finally is to be resilient. Look, I would like to say, this is not going to happen. No organization is 100% safe. So bad things are probably likely to happen. Contain it and make sure you're resilient to recover from that effects of that. And hopefully it's minimal. If recover from any reputational damage, any customer client breach data, such that you are in a posture with a policy in place, you know who does what to whom, and get the ball rolling to recover. So that's important for every board to make sure, working with the management and C-suite executive to make sure those principles are in place.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, knowing what data needs to be protected. Some of the literature suggests that senior leaders and board members have to understand the most important digital assets, what some people like to call the crown jewels of the organization. How do organizations, how should they be approaching this, and how should that spending be aligned with protection of those crown jewels or most critical digital assets? How do you make that happen?
Very relevant question these days. It's ironic, I got my start actually moving from strategy to cybersecurity because of this crown jewel question a few years ago. But the board was asking all these important, pertinent questions. And it was very clear that we have to put a lot of energy on crown jewels because they are at the heart of any business and vital to its functioning. So it can cause a hell of a lot of damage and reputation and otherwise if crown jewels are compromised. Because let's face it, we can't protect all the assets all the time against all attacks. That's simply not realistic. Therefore, you've got to focus on those crown jewels that are critical to the functioning of the business. Once you identify those crown jewels, make sure the right protections are placed around it, and make sure that access controls are put around it so you know who's accessing those crown jewels and when. And the degree of priority spending, therefore, is possible because now you identify critical assets which have to be protected. You can then layer your protections as well as your spending of resources based upon this apex of crown jewels, which you know you have to protect at all costs because the business depends upon it.
Mm-hmm. What I'm hearing here is that you're talking about strategy. And so let's talk strategy right now. Are there particular cyber risk frameworks that organizations should be using to help them understand their security posture and help them actually create a strategy around cyber?
Absolutely. I used to have a mantra in my organization said, tools, not rules. It's nice to have a lot of rules in place, but for people to follow it, really need to have some tools going along with it because that provides a rigor in terms of actually making the rules happen. So the good news actually here is that we do have tools in the form of frameworks. Now, the premier one at a macro level is the NIST cybersecurity framework. That's NIST is for National Institute of Standards and Technology under the US Commerce Department. And this was really chartered about 3 years ago as part of an executive order of the Obama administration to protect critical assets in the US. So it started as a US thing and a US initiative. Guess what? it very quickly grew to have many nations participate in that effort. I was in the early part of it, this evolution, but a lot of nations participated, almost 15 to 20 participated in this evolution. And guess what? There were a lot of companies in the commercial industry who participated in this evolution. So the good news is that as the NIST cybersecurity framework has evolved, it has got tremendous amount of buy-in, not only from the people who run the critical infrastructure of the United States, but also from commercial industry companies, and more importantly, from other countries. So that has been a really good, actually, I would say, emergence of this framework, to such a degree that even China came from a trip to China. They wanted to get a complete briefing on the NIST cybersecurity framework. And of course, we shared with them what was in the public domain on the NIST cybersecurity framework. At the heart of NIST cybersecurity framework is the fact that you can use it effectively to address gaps in your organization. Do a self-assessment, identify the gaps, figure out what remediation is possible, and the NIST cybersecurity framework helps you along that. So you can actually get yourself in a better posture. And it applies to small organizations. It can apply to very well-established organizations to make sure you continuously identify threats and what's going on. So at a macro level, NIST cybersecurity framework. And I would say if at organizational level, it's important to have a framework to prepare against identified threats in any organization, as well as monitor communication training which is taking place in that organization, and be able to react to crises should that happen, by containing the crises itself, making sure the right stakeholder communication is taking place, and have business continuity plans. So between the macro level framework as well as the organizational level framework, you can get yourself to be in a reasonably good place, so you'll have a good sense and arms around what's going on inside of the organization going forward.
So the message is really to pick a framework. You mentioned NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology. I used that a long time ago when I was responsible for starting up a team in General Motors to help design controls into new application systems. So that worked very well there. I also used COBIT in General Motors, and that was great around IT governance, IT processes, and things like that. So a lot of good frameworks out there. Pick one, stick with it, and make it work, I guess, is the message I'm hearing.
Absolutely.
Okay.
The thing is, there's buy-in. So it's not like if you pick NIST, you'll be one off. It's actually great buy-in from across the industry at large.
Yeah. The other thing about NIST is that they're updating it. I saw recently that they realized that the guidance that they put out years ago, maybe in those years when I was designing application systems around passwords, and they've looked at that now and they've actually updated that to say that, that isn't such great guidance. We've got better guidance for you now today. So I think that's great that they update that.
Yeah, there you go. Buy-in really helps to make sure it's a living, breathing document and living, breathing framework.
Absolutely. Okay, let's switch now and talk a little bit more about business risk. How does a company manage the level of business risk? It's so important at the board level that risk is being taken within the guidelines or guardrails that the board has set out. It's often referred to as risk appetite. It's kind of operating within some kind of a known area of decision making.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
First and foremost, the board needs to understand what type of breaches lead to what type of impacts.
Mm-hmm.
It could be reputation. It could be other brand issues which are at the heart of any company. It could be loss of IP if that's very important, and it might not be, but or competitive advantage which you've got. I mean, there have been instances in our business world where people losing IP have lost competitive and gone out of business. I mean, that's very real. So a board has to help navigate and decide what really matters to that particular business. And it could be revenue too, containment, and making sure that the containment recovery operations are in place to, if bad things happen, you are able to correct it. So using frameworks is certainly a step in the right direction because it really gives you a scorecard of where you are and what needs to be done. You need to supplement it with the industry dynamics at work based upon the industry you're in, because breaches are not equal. A breach which takes place in the healthcare industry where a patient record is breached and it has medical device information is very different than a user data which has credit card information. The risk dynamics are very different and the impacts to the industry or the business might be very different, including the individual who loses either credit card information or has his medical device information lost. So you got to factor that in as after you use the frameworks to layer that based upon the business you're conducting and the industry you're in, and what are the sensitivity of the data which might be breached. So that's very important to factor that.
So it's important not only for the security people, but the board to understand what business they're in and then what those critical assets are. We saw in the news recently about HBO, the loss of some real important intellectual property. Of course, that happened to Sony a few years ago. When I was in General Motors, there were news stories about some designs, some real critical product designs in parts of the world being lost. So it can happen to anybody, and you can't just sit there and think that you wouldn't be a target because you don't have the kind of sexy things that are being exposed at these days. Everybody's at risk.
Yeah, and Jay, you bring up an important point, because all these incidents you mentioned, there's some learning to be done from each incident.
Mm-hmm.
I believe, if you learn from the different aspects of companies who've encountered these issues in different parts of the business, you learn a lot. And so you can map it, what these people have in companies have encountered, say, I'm in a particular part of the business. How does this relate to me? Can I suffer this sort of attack or this sort of breach? Mm-hmm. It's very important to understand what's going on with these companies. Yes.
Absolutely. I understand most companies are beginning to look at, or have already looked at, cyber risk insurance for protection. At what point do companies need to be thinking about this and kind of maybe possibly consider buying it?
Yeah, look, you can't get away from insurance, right? It's part and parcel of our lives. And cyber risk insurance is a relatively new concept. I'll admit that. I've talked to some cyber risk insurance companies, and they are some have a few years of experience under their belt. Some are getting into it. There are a few providers. I've spoken, like I said, I've spoken to some, and they're refining the policies based on the risk they assess the businesses in. So they provide you coverage. They want to know how well prepared you are, what mitigations you've got in place, or how well are you positioned with governance to respond to crises, as well as what is the sensitivity of the data you are sort of managing to protect. So those insurance companies, they want to know what risk are they signing up for. Mm-hmm. But conversely, if you're a business signing up for these providers, you need to have your selection based on the carrier track record, and are they new to this business, or they've got experience in this business, and don't accept policies with unreasonable exclusions. You might see some unreasonable exclusions say, yeah, we'll cover you, but we exclude all nation threat attacks and against you. That's not very realistic. So exclusions like that should be realistic, not unrealistic, because that's the reason you're buying cyber insurance, right? Mm-hmm. And they should also offer third-party litigation protection. For example, if PII, that's personally identifying information, is leaked or breached, they should offer against legal judgments, etc. So that's coverage from that. And above all, make sure first-party losses which are suffered in any breach are covered, so that the business interruption costs, extra, aspects which have to be protected against are covered. So there are some aspects, first-party, third-party, as well as making sure the right exclusions are in place, as well as not in place, as the case might be, are very important to consider as you consider cyber insurance.
That's great advice. I'm aware of some companies, or I've read of some companies that have had some real challenges in trying to collect on some of their claims, and some of these policies aren't real clear in terms of what's covered or what's excluded. So it's very good to have some professional advice around that. That's an important aspect that boards and senior leaders need to think about. No question about it.
Okay.
So boards are heavily involved in allocation of resources throughout the organization. Do you have any guidance that might help a board so they can assess management's rationale for investing and allocating resources around cyber risk management, so that they're able to, monitor, protect, and also recover should something occur quickly?
Sure. Firstly, the board needs to identify what to protect the most. As I mentioned before, it could be reputation, mm-hmm. or IP for that business, or customer data, or revenue. I mean, the board may decide, at all costs protect revenue and nothing else. But, that's a call the board needs to make based upon the business they are in. They create lists of access, from minimal access needed, because there will be some people who will need minimal access, and there'll be a large body of those people. But then you may have some individual users who may require wide scope access, but there'll be few of those trusted individuals who require the wide access. Now, from a business standpoint, it may make sense to do that. Nothing wrong with that. We should do that. But like I said, and what we learned from the Snowden incidents is trust but verify. If there are trusted individuals, certainly by all means grant access, and the board should agree to do that and make sure there's adequate verification steps to make sure the right things are again happening. And then not the least of which is emphasize education throughout the organization. Since security is, like I said, everyone's business. And then above all, assign resources, right? I mean, we all have this challenge ahead of us, right? I've dealt with that many, many times, and ongoing threats and all that may make even resources very precious. Given the skills shortage, so you got to make sure adequately resources are assigned to basically monitor, protect, and respond. It's like the mantra, you know, like CPR, you worry about MPR, monitor, protect, and respond. And the resources in an organization are assigned to those three critical aspects of cybersecurity protections.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So lastly, let's touch on the idea that nobody is perfect, and that there's really an aspect of continuous improvement around cyber. So how can a company address gaps maybe that have been uncovered in preparedness, education and training, how they assess their threats, the governance? How can they do that more systematically?
Yeah. Very important. No one is immune from attacks. The assumption by the board should be that they provide a great deal of oversight, and very helpful oversight at that, by working with the CEO, CIO, COO, CFO, and so on, to make sure that the security preparedness in the organization is in place. And that's a starting point. They also need to establish a risk management playbook with existing business processes, detailed cyber incident response plans, crises action plans, and making sure that by the action steps, they're creating a cyber risk-aware culture, and with the key aspects being systemically ingrained in the organization. Now, that's not an easy task. It doesn't happen overnight. But if you have that risk-aware culture, you can make a lasting impact on a continuous improvement, because we will have to require continuous improvement in any organization, because the threats and the nature of the threats are constantly evolving and changing. Good things are becoming bad, bad things are becoming worse. And so you've got to continuously change. And the great thing is, if you have a cyber risk-aware culture seep through the organization, you will have people in the trenches who will have great ideas and great practices to be put in place, which will make the organization as a whole be more evolutionary and be continuous to be protecting all assets they've got, and with great innovative ideas coming from the trenches itself.
Mm-hmm. You touched on culture, which is so absolutely critical. I started up a strategic risk management program for General Motors, and it's really all about culture and behavior and people wanting to do the right thing and knowing what the right thing is to do. So I completely agree with what you've said. Hira, I want to thank you for your time today. This has been a very enjoyable discussion, but I do want to open it up. If there's anything maybe I didn't ask about that you'd like to emphasize here before we close, go ahead.
One thing on the last point you just made. Yeah, having the culture is very important, because you get away from this checkmark mentality. If people just check the boxes, I'm secure, or something like that. So you get away from that, because culture really helps people to think it through, internalize it viscerally, and say, yep, what is the right thing to do? So very important from a culture standpoint. Look, my parting thoughts of this. So cybersecurity is has gained traction, but I think there are significant disconnects still in the businesses we all manage. And there are namely threefold. One is there's an increasing number of breaches, as I mentioned, responsibly. And even my expectations were that we will plateau, and it's showing that where we industry-wise think, well, we've done good stuff, but the numbers are proving that in the last 6 months that there's a lot of work ahead of us. Mm-hmm. Secondly is protection versus actual breaches. What I mean by that, there was a recent study which came out that when they looked and talked to the CIO, they thought, yep, we have great protections in place, but the numbers belied those expectations, that there were a higher number of breaches than you would think were possible, with the CIO saying, yep, I've got adequate protection in place. There's a disconnect which needs to be bridged there. And third and lastly, which is very important, is with the board of directors. There was a recent Harvard Business Review, it's on my LinkedIn page, which looked and polled about 5,000 board of directors, Mm-hmm. And to a T, they all agreed that cybersecurity made the list in the top 10. should be top 2, top 3, but anyway, it made the list. But what was disheartening was the fact that all of them agreed to a T, that it was ranked dead last in the processes from an oversight role they looked at. So here's a disconnect, right? Fairly high in terms of ranking cybersecurity, but the processes in place and providing oversight of that ranked dead last. And partly, again, it's got to deal with the fact of their familiarity with cybersecurity, the evolutionary nature of cybersecurity and what's happening, and how to put their arms around it. So this requires heightened awareness and education going forward to ensure that these disconnects are really taken care of and remediated and brought much closer together, so we have an actual view about what's really going on and how can we actually be better going forward with any business.
Hira, thank you so much for your time today. I think the message for boards of directors is very clear. We need to have active involvement and oversight. And I think the words you've shared today will help them move along that continuum to continuous improvement. So thank you so much.
I hope so. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Jay.